Good afternoon and welcome to this, the third in our Advent Studies series, When the Rubber Hits the Road. Today we're up to the mark of mission, which deals with our relationship with creation. Often this is the last in the list, but we have tweaked the list slightly and we're dealing with this week, and we will keep Transform for our final session next week. Summarised as treasure, this mark of mission is to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. And so our theme hymn, For the Beauty of the Earth, holds this whole idea in our hearts very closely.
Treasuring is partly about our vocation of appreciation and enjoyment. We have a vocation as followers of God to appreciate what God has made and to love it and to really think about it. People do this all the time. The poets do it, the scientists do it. They unpack the marvels of the universe. And it's part of what it is to be human, to actually appreciate the environment in which we live.
And of course God did too, didn't he, she, God? Yeah. That wonderful quote right at the very beginning of Genesis in chapter 1, in verse 31, where God has created everything. And the verse reads, God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good.
Very good.
Yes.
And when you compare it with all the other creation myths in the ancient Near East and in China, all over the world and in Africa, it's not about everything being very good. Usually it's about horrible struggles and things. The unique understanding of the Hebrew people was that creation was fundamentally good. Everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And in creation we tend to see God's self-expression. This is God's artistry, God's science, God's self-expression, God's painting, if you like. And it's valued because God loves it.
When we were looking for an image to use with this section, the multiplicity of images was just overwhelmed us really. What can we use as an image for you to talk about God's self-expression, to talk about the extraordinary beauty of the creation, the natural world in which we live? We ended up with the hummingbird, which you'll be looking at now, I think, yeah. With the hummingbird, not because it's more beautiful than anything else, but simply because it is so beautiful, like so many things in the creation.
And there's a real sense in which God is present in all created things. And if you want to stretch that concept, everything in a sense is God flesh, part of God, literally. Now I know there's a bit of a problem,
a theological problem perhaps,
but it is a beautiful idea that has not been well developed in the Christian tradition. And I would encourage everybody who's a follower of Jesus, who embodied flesh, to see God's flesh in all things.
Often when you talk to artists and poets and authors, they will talk about the things they have created as almost as being like their babies. There is something of them in each of the things that they have created. And I suspect it is like that for God. In everything that God has created, God has this deep, deep love and link to it. So I think that this gives us a real obligation not to damage the creation, a very deep obligation not to damage the creation. We were thinking of some of the ways in which creation is damaged, and there is quite a list, isn't there? There is quite a list. We'd like to suggest some of them to you tonight, but you may well have ideas about some other things that you would like to talk about amongst yourselves in the discussions afterwards, or reflect on if you're doing this study alone. So the really obvious one, the one that I think probably will come to people's minds first, is pollution. The pollution of the air, of the seas, the pollution of space now with all the space junk which is floating around about us, all the plastic in the oceans. Yeah. Did you want to say any more about pollution?
Well, it's sort of self-evident, isn't it? But we contribute to it, and it's good to reflect occasionally, I think, on how we as individual consumers impact pollution. It's one thing to pick up a whole lot of plastic bags, it's another thing to adopt a less consumptive lifestyle. The other one that we do is overpopulation, and so many of the other damaging things that happen to creation flow from that. We are seriously overpopulated as a world, and I suppose steps are being taken to stop that. We could take individual steps, although most of us have passed that now, I think.
Yeah.
But overpopulation is one of the big things that has contributed to the damaging of society. One of the great things of overpopulation has been the overpopulation of goats and sheep. Whole ecosystems have been ruined by teeth, the teeth of cows, goats, sheep, and other animals like that.
So overpopulation is not just about the political hot potato of people, it's also about the overpopulation through monocultures and things like that, which has led to the denuding of vast tracts of good agricultural land. There's a thing about the way in which particular animals eat, where some of them, you know this much better than I do, some of them in the way they eat actually tear out the roots of the grass.
And then other animals like cows ruin the country by stamping on it, basically. Heavy-footed, hard-footed animals. When a cow hits the ground, it's entirely different from when a kangaroo hits the ground. And we introduce cows, and we have degraded, unbelievably degraded, the Australian landscape.
Another issue that I think people are very aware of now, of course, is overconsumption. There have been programs like, is it Waste Watchers, that have talked about the fashion industry, talked about the enormous amount of waste that there is in the fashion industry, the huge quantities of clothing that some people buy and throw out not even having worn in Western societies. Some years ago, an Australian thinker, philosopher called Clive Hamilton wrote a book called Affluenza, which has got a great title, a fabulous title. But he talked about the impact of overconsumption in affluent societies on the societies as a whole, just looking at it environmentally and also looking at it socially and psychologically and emotionally for people. His argument is that it is catching, and I think he's right. If we live in a highly consumerist society, we are more likely to be consumerist ourselves. It becomes just part of what people do. You go to the shops on the weekend. I could be very pious and say instead of coming to church, people should be in church, not the shops. But for many people, going into a place where you can spend your money and you have power over how you spend your money is actually gives them some psychological sense of agency and of belonging. It's been very interesting to see the impact of the pandemic on all of these trends in our society And there seems to me to be a developing sense of thrift, actually, of making do, of reusing, of learning some of the old arts and crafts, of sewing and knitting and things like that, which is a very interesting development in our society, and I'll be fascinated to see where it takes us. It's partly a response to the awareness of just how we have degraded our planet, but it is also, I believe, a response to a greater sense of community, of wanting community, and of recognising and helping each other, of barter and trade and making do. There are people in our society at the moment who have suffered enormously economically as families, as individuals, through the pandemic, and need to have a helping hand. And people are doing that. They're reaching out the helping hands, giving food for each other, making meals for each other. In Canberra, I don't know what's been happening here, but in Canberra there is a Sikh family who have been making meals. They started off making meals at the beginning of the pandemic for a few members of the Indian community in Canberra, and there's quite a big Indian community, who had lost their jobs and needed meals. This has grown to the most enormous charity out of the pandemic, and people all over the city are giving money to pay for food, and these people are delivering thousands of meals around the city to people who are in need. Most extraordinary and wonderful response. In a sense, that's a response to human need through loving service, so it goes in last week. But it's also that sense of building community as we respond to diminishing resources.
And one of the worst things we've done as a species is to indulge in activities that contribute to global warming. And the worst by far of those is the burning of fossil fuel. Whereas now the world ecology is on a tipping point because of it. We just have to hope that nations wake up to themselves and research is done well and people stop burning the fuel. And the discussions in Glasgow go some way to beginning to redress that. I suppose our big hope is in radical breakthroughs in technology, and we should pray for them.
We instinctively know that these things, that overconsumption, overpopulation, monocultures, the activities that contribute to global warming and to pollution, damage the world that we have been given and which most people naturally cherish. And throughout history, as we've suggested earlier, it has often been the mystics and the artists and the poets who have led us into a deeper appreciation of the beauty of the gift of the world that we have all been born into. It is the only one we have, and it is extraordinarily beautiful. But this is not a new perception at all. In the Christian tradition, going back over many centuries, you can read writers who have just dived into the beauty of creation. And St. Francis is an obvious one. About 1,000 years ago, St. Francis, with his radical vow of poverty and his befriending of the whole of the created order, the animals, the birds, hello, brother sun, sister moon. St. Francis so deeply immersed himself, became one with the creation of which we're all a part. Another one who wrote very beautifully about it and whose writings we still have is Hildegard of Bingen. And she had this wonderful line, I think it's the most beautiful, simple line: creation is the song of God. Fabulous. In the 20th century, there's been a whole movement of eco-theologians. Eco-theology's been a whole thing, and some of you may well have been involved in reading groups or have heard about these things over the last few decades. Certainly in the time that Ian and I were theological students and then in ministry, ecotheology was a big thing. As an understanding, trying to understand this link and how we as humans can relate to God in creation. One of the very famous 20th century eco-theologians is an American called Thomas Berry, who wrote very widely about our relationship with God in creation. And one of the things that he wrote is, I'll ask Ian to read this because you're probably sick of my voice by now.
The natural world is the larger sacred community to which we belong. To be alienated from this community is to become destitute in all that makes us human. To damage this community is to diminish our own existence.
I think this quote highlights beautifully the interconnectedness between us as humans and the creation of which we are a part. We can set ourselves aside from it, and there are quite some pressures perhaps in modern life that do set us apart from the natural rhythms of life, from the way that things are stitched together in the world. We often talk about children not knowing where milk really comes from, or not understanding where meat comes from, thinking it just comes out of the supermarket somehow magically. But those are symptoms perhaps of a greater dislocation which happens in people's minds. And we need to be reminded often of this interconnectedness and the impact that our actions have on the world, and that the impact that then has on our own existence. I don't think that is so much an issue for people who live here on the North Coast, because you live in a very beautiful, lush, rural, agricultural area. But certainly in the larger cities, it is definitely a factor.
So what's happening now around the world? Well, there are a whole lot of secular green movements, and it's become a major political thrust in the life of democracies. The green movement, the green parties. And I think it springs from an intuitive human sense of the sacredness of the world. People don't want the world to be so damaged. Partly it's self-interest, they want to have perfectly good access to food and that sort of thing, and security, but it springs also from the heart. And something to be celebrated and variously supported, not necessarily politically, but supported as a real attempt to honour and value the world. As Sarah was talking about, eco-theology, quite developed now. There's the efforts made by various nations, like the ones all getting together in Glasgow. And for me, the exciting one is the renewable energies technology. I think we're going to crack it somehow. There's all sorts of indications that we'll improve as a species at capturing energy for ourselves.
There's an interesting tension, I find, in that whole discussion about renewable energies, in that part of the thrust is to replace our current energy sources that are polluting with ones that are less polluting, so that there's a shift. But there's also that whole question about whether the extent to which we can reduce energy consumption. So you've got to think, well, if we're just going to use as much energy as we have, but produce it differently, certainly we'll be ahead, and a lot further ahead as a species on the world in honouring this beautiful creation of which we are a part. But I think there are movements to be made, there are things that we can do to be less consumptive. I mean, it's exactly this, less consumer-oriented. It's exactly this idea of we probably are consuming more than we need
We
to
have
sustain
so much stuff.
more to sustain. Like we often reflect on the fact that we had much more in our houses than our parents had, and our children have got much more than we had, and our grandchildren, it's kind of exponential, really. You know, we've got 2 granddaughters, you go into their bedrooms and it's kind of wall-to-wall plastic.
Yeah.
And then you go into the garage and there are these large tubs full of the things that they no longer use. It's an extraordinary amount of clothing. I went there one afternoon a couple of years ago and I was treated to a fashion parade of all their princess and fairy dresses. Were you there? Yes. The girls coming out in their princess dresses. And they had about 5, no, they had more than that. They had about 8 each fairy dresses. I thought, heavens, you know, these are children from a comfortably off household. But it was extraordinary. I don't think I had 8 dresses growing up. I'm not saying I didn't have shoes when I had to walk to school without any shoes on or anything like that. But there's been enormous growth in our consumption just in a relatively short time. And I think that's also something we need to be looking at as well. Around the world too, church leaders and Anglican church leaders have been very vocal in their local areas and in multilateral forums such as the UN. And Justin Welby, who is, as I'm sure you know, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has spoken out often on the issue of climate change, noting that climate change is loading the dice by intensifying storms and making rain patterns less predictable. This has a devastating effect on agriculture, and particularly in marginal country. And there are many Anglican dioceses around the world who are in marginal country. And I thought Ian is actually, in a past existence, an agriculturalist, so I thought he might talk a bit about that.
Well, as a scientist might say, in relation to the impact of global warming, we ain't seen nothing yet. It's going to get ugly, seriously ugly. And we'll have to be extremely adaptable in handling much more volatile weather systems, much longer droughts, much more frequent, devastating cyclones and things. We'll just have to be very clever. It'll probably mean we'll eat different things, and drink different things, and live different lifestyles. Because it's not going to stop. We can slow it down to some extent, but the effect is just enormous.
One of the places where we can see the effects very clearly already is in the Pacific Ocean and the microstates of the Pacific Oceans, many of which have been very badly affected by the rising sea levels. I have been in international meetings with Anglican leaders who have spoken about their parishes, their dioceses, where when there is a king tide, the island disappears and the water just sweeps across through people's houses, taking away their cooking pots, all of that sort of stuff. Already there are some climate refugees from the Pacific who have been moved to New Zealand. The bishops, particularly the bishops from these dioceses, have spoken out in international gatherings and at the UN, pleading for their people. And a number, of course, of the politicians from those countries went to the Global Climate Conference in Glasgow, as they have gone to earlier ones, and pleaded just for the continued existence of their nations. There is in the Anglican Communion an environmental network which links people across the globe. The Anglican Church developed the World Wide Web long before it became an internet thing. There are Anglicans everywhere. There are Anglicans in all sorts of unexpected places. I was astonished to meet Anglicans from Cuba, from Madagascar, from South Korea. Well, actually, I shouldn't have been astonished by the South Korea one, but I was a bit. There are Anglicans all over the world, and when we gather together, this worldwide reach gives enormous strength to the perspectives that are gathered. It gives great lived experience being expressed within the same community, within the same communion of faith. And if you look at the Anglican Communion Environmental Network, and we give the website address in the website page, our resources page on the Cathedral website, you'll see there are some very good resources on that, and you'll see people speaking out about the experiences all around the world of dealing with the impacts of climate change. There's also a group called Anglican Bishops for Climate Justice, who speak from direct personal knowledge of the impact of climate change in their areas. And you'll find some of their statements there on the Environmental Network website, which I really do commend to you. It's a great website.
Well, what's happening in this diocese, I wonder? We don't know, of course, but I'm guessing that quite a lot is, because when we used to be here, there was a energetic attempt to come to terms with things ecological, things green, and, well, you could discuss it with each other about what's happening, whether there's more to be done or whether you're happy with what's going on, probably.
I remember there were some really good debates in the synod, some excellent motions that came through to the various synods, looking at environmental questions and how parishes and the diocese as a whole could live as responsible stewards of God's creation.
Well, as we come towards the end, back to the idea of the vocation of appreciation and enjoyment. The vocation, the Christian vocation of appreciation is, well, this has got three parts. One is to rejoice in creation, the small things, the large things, to rejoice in things like the blue whales, the song of the blue whales, with the stuff that we do, but to do it more often perhaps, to be really aware of trees and gardens and forests and ants. Now, I say ants because if you ever need to be engaged with nature, you can almost always find ants, even in city environments. And usually we just don't pay any attention to them, but they're wonderful to watch. They talk to each other. You can see them going backwards and forwards, exchanging information, sharing food, building their little houses. We could just ignore them, or we could engage with them and appreciate them and find joy in them. The same is true of flowers. We can just walk past the flower, or we can actually look at it and appreciate it and think how wonderful that flower is. I did a funeral for a woman who was into blue bees. Now, I didn't even know what a blue bee was. I had never seen one. But she had it as a theme for her funeral. She had blue bee pictures and that was worked into her eulogy. And ever since, I've become aware of blue bees and rejoiced when I saw them. And that's a tiny little example. But I'm guessing that every single one of us has rejoiced in something natural and beautiful in creation. We all admired wonderful sunrises and sunsets and things like that. Rejoicing in creation does give us that obligation to do what we can individually to safeguard the integrity of it all. And to be thankful, to be intentionally thankful to God about what God has made. It's one thing to really appreciate things, it's another thing to be genuinely thankful, to be focused on the fact that God has made it, and to rejoice.
Do we actually take the time that we need to take? I've noticed myself, since we've been here in Grafton, I love frangipanis. I just love frangipani flowers, and I love the scent of frangipani. And when we were coming up here, when we knew that finally that the COVID restrictions would enable us to come and be with you for these weeks, I was saying to Ian, the frangipanis will be out. And when we lived here, he used to bring me a frangipani flower every morning that he'd just pick up on his way back from buying the papers at some extraordinarily early hour of the morning that I didn't even know existed. And I realised just this morning, as I was sort of racing from the Cathedral to the office for something before the start of the service, that I've actually been walking past the frangipani flowers and I've looked at them and thought, aren't they beautiful? But I haven't stopped and picked some up and take them back and put them on the table and smelt them and really entered into their extraordinary beauty. So I will do that because it is, the treasuring is at least a step deeper, isn't it? The treasuring is more than just saying, isn't that lovely? The treasuring is spending time and entering into it in a deeper sense.
Intentionally.
Intentionally.
Yeah, sometimes when I go, one of my very favourite parts of creation is the beach. Mm. And every now and then when I'm rushing into the sea, I rush with God and I'm saying to God, whoa, isn't this good? And I think that gladdens God's heart, certainly gladdens mine. Mm. And to treasure things intentionally and sensibly and deeply is wonderful.
Mm. So don't forget the website and the questions, some reflection questions are on the website. But please, of course, discuss anything that this has raised for you, anything that you might disagree violently with us about some things, or you might find yourself in fierce agreement with us. Toss it around. Treasure it. Treasure the discussion as well. And of course, any feedback, as usual, to the parish office. Linda collects them, collates them, and gives them to us as a bit of a document from you all. So thank you for that, and thank you for sticking with us through this Advent study series. One more to go when we will be talking about transforming the unjust structures. It sounds pretty, doesn't it? Muscular, yeah. I've got to say. But once again, we thought we would finish with the Teresa of Avila quotation and encourage you again to put it into the first person.
Oh, well, I'll read it in the first person. Is that all right?
All right. And then I'll read it in that one. Okay?
Oh, okay. Christ says, no body but mine, no hands, no feet on earth but mine. Mine are the eyes with which he looks compassion on the world. Mine are the feet with which he walks to do good. Mine are the hands with which he blesses all the world. Mine are the hands, mine are the feet, mine are the eyes, mine are his body. Christ says, nobody now on earth but me. Mine. No hands, no feet on earth but mine. Mine are the eyes with which he looks compassion on the world. Christ has no body now on earth but mine.
And Christ has no body but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes. You are his body. Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks compassion on this world. Christ has no body now on earth but yours. May God, who has entrusted us with this creation, who has created us and put us in the midst of a beautiful world to sustain and nurture us, fill your hearts with joy, with appreciation, that you may treasure the gift that we have been given, and the blessing of God our Creator, God the Redeemer, and God the giver of life and love be with you now and always. Amen.